Good morning. For the first time, I'm preaching a sermon from my home, and there's no congregation that I can see. How things have changed. Recently, Donna went to the grocery store, and they were turning away people who didn't have a mask. Not long ago, if you saw somebody walking around with a mask, you would think that was unusual. How things have changed. I've just finished 2 books about the chaotic change that we're going to face in the future. The first one was called Rings of Fire by Leonard Sweet, and the second one was 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Harari. And these books catalog the great changes we're going to face in the future. It talks about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is going to take away so many people's jobs. It talks about how our bodies are going to be integrated with machines, sort of like Robocop. I can hardly wait for that. It talks about climate change and the drastic changes we're going to face in the future because of climate change, the mass migration of people. It talks about truth, how truth is changing. What is truth? It talks about religion and how religion is changing as well. What do you do when, as part of your very best efforts, everything around you seems to change? When the very foundation, the very ground that you're standing on seems to be shifting and shaking? Why is change so hard? I'd like to answer that question by examining the life of Abram. And in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 4, it talks about that. I'd like to read chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to a place that I will show you." And in verse 3, he says, "I will bless you, and bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." First of all, change is difficult, I think, because it involves leaving. It involves separation from people, from places, from those kind of relationships that we've had. Why did Abraham leave? What did Abraham leave? He left his country, and he physically had to change his residence. He had to go from one place to another. He went to a place where they would have different laws, they would have different foods, they would have different customs. Even the land itself would be different. And in those days, that was even a greater challenge than it is today. Differences between places were more pronounced than they are today. There was no mass culture to smooth things out. There was no McDonald's, there was no Facebook, there was no way of connecting like Google or Twitter. So he left his country. He left his people and his father's household. Abram was leaving his extended family. And in the ancient Far East, that was very important. You see, they didn't have geographical areas. They didn't have countries. They had the connections were through the clan and to their tribe. So Abraham was not only going to be separated geographically, he was going to be separated socially. And he had to leave all those things behind. And in all likely, he wouldn't be able to go back to where he had come from. He wouldn't be able to connect with those people. He couldn't FaceTime them. He couldn't, send them an email. So in short, Abraham's leaving was complete. He was experiencing a chaotic change. Change is so hard for us because it involves leaving. Some of you have been laid off from your jobs. Some of you have been working at home. And when that happens, we miss the workplace setting. We miss those relationships that we have with people that we work with. Some of the experts are now telling us that children are beginning to suffer because they aren't going to school. They miss those social interactions. Change is not only hard because it involves loss, but change is difficult because it involves risk. Change is hard. What did God tell Abram about where he was going? He said this, "Go to the land I will show you." Well, thanks, God. Where is that? I want a map. I want to know where I'm going. I want to know how I'm going to get there. I want to know what it's going to be like when I'm there. And I just can't call CA and get a travel plan. See, change launches us into uncertainty and into risk. You may be working from home. You may have been laid off, as I said. But when you're in that situation, your mind begins to think, well, how am I going to pay my bills? There's a real risk involved here. And there are so many uncertainties. And what uncertainties and fears do you feel? Change involves risk. Most of us don't like risk. Most of us find it terrifying. So how can we survive and yet even thrive in the midst of change? I think first of all, we have to remember that everything in this world is temporary. Our possessions, our relationships, our bodies, all the things that we hold dear to us are all going to pass away. But that doesn't mean that they're not important or that we wouldn't mourn their loss. But we must not become so attached to something, must not hold on to something so tight that it almost has to be ripped from our fingers. We need to eventually let it go because everything is temporary. So by faith, Abraham, when he was called to go to a place he would later receive as an inheritance, he obeyed and he went. By faith, he made his journey to that promised land. And it was said, the word says this, for he was looking forward to the city with foundation, whose architect and builder was God. If Abraham and his family had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have never left. Instead, they probably would have stayed there and they would have missed out everything that God had for them. But the word says, therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he prepared for them a city. It's very comforting when the transitory and impermanent nature of life causes us to reflect on the life to come. In that life, there's no more separation, there's no more mourning, there's no more sickness, no death. We need to look forward to a city that God has prepared for us. Remember, everything in this world is temporary. Secondly, I think we need to remember that although our circumstances may change, God never changes. His promises toward us don't change. His love for us doesn't change, and his concern for us never changes. Look at the promise that was given to Abraham. Chapter 12 and verse 3. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and the people on earth will be blessed through you. Was God faithful? Of course he was faithful. Malachi 3 and 6 says, I, the Lord, do not change. In Hebrews 13 and 8 says, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Roger Sims was hitchhiking his way home, and he said he'd never forget that day, May the 7th. He was discharged from the military. He had his uniform on. He was carrying a heavy suitcase, and he was standing by the road hitchhiking, and along came a nice, black, sleek, new Cadillac. To his surprise, it stopped. He threw his suitcase in the back seat, got into the driver's side, and the driver was a middle-aged man dressed in a business suit, and he thanked him for picking him up, and the man said, are you going home for keeps? Sure, Roger responded. Well, you're in luck, he said. I'm going to Chicago. Roger said, well, I'm not going quite that far. He says, I have a business there in Chicago. And after talking about many things, Roger, who was a Christian, felt this compulsion to share Christ, share the gospel with this man, Mr. Hanover. And so as they got about 30 miles from the town where Roger lived, he decided that he better do it now or never. So he shared the gospel, he shared Christ, and this man pulled a Cadillac over, and Roger thought, I think he's going to kick me out. But instead he put his head on the steering wheel, and he wept and he cried. And he said, this is the happiest day of my life as he accepted Christ. 5 years went by, and Roger was married, he had a couple of kids, and he had a business of his own. And as it happened, he was going to Chicago on a business trip, and he found this card in the suitcase, and he thought he would go to Hanover Enterprises and see if he could meet this gentleman. So the receptionist met him, and she said, well, and when he asked if he could see Mr. Hanover, the receptionist said, no, but you can see Mrs. Hanover. And so he was taken upstairs into this office, facing this young lady, about 50. He extended her hand, and she said, you knew my husband? Roger said, well, I was hitchhiking, he picked me up. And she said, well, when was that? He said, well, I'll never forget that day. That was May the 7th, the day I was discharged from the Army. And Roger wondered if he should mention to this lady the fact that he had witnessed to her husband. So he explained that he had pulled over the side of the road, that he had accepted Christ. And all of a sudden, this lady began to weep and she began to sob. And Roger thought, oh my, what's this about? And so finally she pulled herself together and she said, I've prayed for my husband for 5 years that he would accept Christ. And Roger asked, well, where is your husband? And Mrs. Hanover said, well, he's dead. You see, on May the 7th, the day he picked you up, after he left you off, he was in a terrible accident and he was instantly killed. You see, I thought, and I was mad at God. She said, I thought God had not kept his promise, and for 5 years, I stopped going to church and I was mad at God. You know, although our circumstances change, God never changes. He always keeps his promise. And if we're going to survive change, we need to remember that everything is temporary. Remember that although our circumstances change, God never changes. And we need to take courage in the knowledge that God knows and controls our future. He is the one in control of every change in our life. He's guiding all events according to his good purposes. Isaiah 46:9, verse 10, and the last part of verse 11 says this, I am the God, and there's no other. I am God, and there's none like me. I will make known to the ends from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say, my purposes will stand, and I will do all that I please. What I've said, that will I bring about. What I have planned, that I will do. What was the purpose and the result of Abraham's change? It was the foundation of the Jewish nation, and of course, the birth of Jesus Christ, our Savior. You see, God is in control of all the changes that take place in your life and in my life. God has a plan for you and me. It's a loving plan, and it's a wise plan. He's working it all out, even now. His love for you never diminishes and never ceases. Are you struggling with change? To survive and thrive in change, you need to reach your hand out to God. He's reaching out to you even now. Reach out to God in prayer. Clasp his hand. You know, I need to do that when I face change. It's the only way to survive change. For reflection, we're going to listen to the male chorus from our church as they sing that song. And I'd like you to reflect upon this. He leadeth me.